Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wayne's World of Science and Technology. Today, we're going to talk about 50 years of microprocessors and evaluation of transistor density. And hopefully it'll work this time because this is the fifth try. I've been having fun with my tongue. It's been tripping all over the place. So, in the beginning was the transistor. This was invented in the 50s, and it is actually our most used invention. There are more transistors made than any other device that humans have ever invented. The transistor is the basis of the microprocessor. Basically, a microprocessor is a bunch of transistors shoved into a very small package. And transistor size shrinkage is an industry game. The more transistors you can fit into a space, the more you can do. And you can usually cut down on power usage and a whole bunch of other things as well, which is really useful. These are single transistors. Now, I have actually seen transistors as big as my fist. They're used for power control in electronics, in specifically electrical engine control situations with direct current systems. These transistors off to the right are relatively small. They're basically about the size of a speck of rice. So that gives you an idea for size. But then we go forward to the first generally available microprocessor, the Intel 4004. It was produced in 1971. It had a grand total of 2,250 transistors. And note that we can actually count this fairly accurately, at least at this stage. This was in a 12 square millimeter package, and it had 188 transistors per square millimeter. Now, a square millimeter, there's 25.2 millimeters in an inch, so that gives you an idea of how big a square millimeter is for those who are used to imperial. This processor formed the basis of many calculators and a few early computers. It was extremely limited, but it was miles better than soldering a bunch of transistors to a breadboard. Yeah, imagine soldering 2,250 transistors to a breadboard. Would have taken a while. A decade later, Intel introduced the 80286. This is 1982. It had 134,000 transistors in a 104 millimeter square package. The package size increased because, well, hey, if you can increase the area, it's like sizes of ships. Ships got bigger because it's more. You could stick more into a single package. This had 1,288 transistors per millimeter squared, 6.85 times the number of transistors per square millimeter in 10 years, which is a quite considerable increase. Again, common desktop computer chip. All the chips I'm picking here are chips that are commonly available to the consumer. Remember that. I've actually had several of these. They were a great chip in their day. By today's standards, they're horribly slow and inefficient, but back then, they were amazing. Totally amazing. Then we get to the Pentium in 1993. It has approximately because at this point, it's no longer possible to count individual transistors. They're just too small. Approximately 3.1 million transistors in a 294 millimeter square package, which is 10,544 transistors per square millimeter. That's 56.09 times the number of transistors per square millimeter in 20 years. That is a absolutely insane increase. Now, this chip was notorious at the time for being hot. Up to this point, everything had been passively cooled. At this point, passive cooling was no longer an option. There were jokes when the Pentium came out about being able to brew your coffee by putting your coffee cup on a Pentium chip. They were that hot, but not as hot as chips get today. On the other hand, chips today have active cooling. Now we jump up into the new century. We've got the AMD Athlon 64 3400 in 2001. It had approximately 105 million transistors on a 193 square millimeter package. That's approximately 544,000 transistors per square millimeter. Note at this point I'm going to leave off the last little bit. And that's approximately 2,890 times the number of transistors per square millimeter in 30 years. Think of that. Okay? Now this also jumped to the expanded AMD 64 architecture. There were a bunch of other architectural changes in here which I have not discussed. If you folks want a more in-depth explanation of the move from 4 to 8 to 16 to 32 to 64-bit and the number of gigaflops per second these processors can punch out, I'll happily do it. Just leave a comment. Then we get into the teens. At this point, I'm switching to Apple because besides AMD and Intel, Apple makes a lot of chips. They sell a ton of chips. The Apple A5 came out in 2011. It had 500,000 transistors on a 122 millimeter square package. Now notice that the package is smaller, but this is a cell phone chip. It had approximately 4 million and so called 4,098,000 transistors per square millimeter, which is 21,799 or 21,800 times the number of transistors per square millimeter in 40 years. Think about that. That is incredible. Now, this is a mobile phone processor, of course, and at this point, the mobile phone processors were finally catching up with the desktop processors. No, they weren't as powerful, but they were getting darn close. And then we get into the 20s. This time I picked a laptop chip, the AMD Ryzen 7 6800H. Again, a common chip, came out in 2022. It has 10 billion transistors on a 122 millimeter square package. That is approximately 50 million transistors per square millimeter. Think of that. This is miniaturization. That's 266,000 times the number of transistors in 50 years. As I said, this is a specialized laptop processor, and it's an excellent one. My ex-wife has one in her computer, and she absolutely loves it. And we come to the new age. Now, this, even though it's only a couple years later, I'm including it for a very specific reason. This is the AMD Ryzen 9 9950X3D. Came out in 2025 this year. It has 16 billion transistors on a 208 millimeter square package. That's approximately 63 million transistors per square millimeter, or approximately 335,000 times the number of transistors per square millimeter in 50 years. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because a couple of years before this, AMD had introduced their first double layer processor. It was an extremely good performer, but there were limitations to it. Then they came out with the next generation, and all of a sudden those limitations weren't there. This is the third generation of double layer chips. Now, it's not actually a full double layer. Only about 25% of the chip is 2 layers, but think, if you can put a second layer on top of a chip, all of a sudden the number of transistors per millimeter square goes way up, because up till now we've been talking single plane. What if, just think of this, what if you could go further? Well, they are planning a bunch of more node shrinks, but some of the current chip features are now only a few atoms wide, so there are limitations hitting here. Adding extra layers is a great way of increasing extra transistors per square millimeter, but cooling is the main limitation faced by multiple layer processors. Every layer adds more heat. Heat is the enemy of efficiency because it increases resistance in the circuits, which adds more heat, and you can soon end up in meltdown mode. So, there are a lot of difficult things to solve here, but there are some extremely creative people working on this, and well, we're going to have to see how things develop over the next decade. We often underestimate microprocessors. I mean, they're everywhere. We use them all the time, but we still underestimate them because they are so ubiquitous. But there isn't a single car built since 1984 in North America that doesn't have at least one microprocessor. There isn't a single cell phone, mobile phone, these days that doesn't have a microprocessor. As a matter of fact, none of the ones going back, as far as I know, that you would consider a cell phone were built with anything other than a microprocessor. Think of all the children's toys that have microprocessors. Your microwave, your coffee maker. You got a Keurig, it's got a microprocessor. They're everywhere. My desk is a microprocessor. As proof, there's the power function. And with the increasing processing power we are gaining the ability to do things that we never could before. How should I put it? This is like Aristotle's lever. It's a way of moving the earth. Maybe not physically, but definitely it's going to make changes. Anyways, that's it for now, folks. Like, share, subscribe if you got something out of this. Have a good day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.